decade or so, we have seen millions of learners having dropped out of school. Given this shocking statistic, one would think that the Department of Education would do everything to get its learners back to school. However, it was revealed by the department that there are no mechanisms in place to track, to trace, and keep learners in school. This is a national crisis, and lockdowns have only exacerbated the situation. This is why the DA has vehemently been opposed to rotational schooling and as such went to court to compel government to get all learners back in school. This court action has led to government finally scrapping the damaging policy of rotational schooling. And so in the Spotlight this week, we focus on our education system. We unpack the reasons behind our high dropout rate and also what are some of the plans that we would have in place to fix the situation. To discuss all of this and more, we are joined in studio by DA leader John Steenhuisen, the DA Shadow Minister of the Basic Education, Nodada, and our Western Cape Provincial Minister of Education, Debbie Schaefer, and we've got Keith Richardson, the CEO of the Principals Academy Trust. Welcome, everybody.
Great to be with you, sir. Great to be with the guests. Thanks for the opportunity.
We'll jump straight into it. John, why did the DA go to court to get rotational schooling scrapped, and why was it important?
Well, I think it was very, very important because the one group of people who've not had a voice in all of this are the learners, are the school children, who have had to listen to other people making decisions about their lives. We wanted to give them a voice. We know that rotational schooling has had a devastating impact on literacy and numeracy in South Africa, a country that already has very low outputs in terms of numeracy and literacy when compared both continentally and internationally. And the fact that rotational learning has disproportionately disadvantaged poorer learners from poorer communities, where it's not been possible for them to do online schooling because there's no internet connectivity or there's no devices. They've essentially missed out, in many instances, on over half their schooling time over this period. It's going to have a devastating long-term impact on their ability to get involved in the economy, to find a job, to study further if they want to, if they have been disadvantaged in this way. And so we felt it was very, very important to show government that we were serious about this. There's been a malaise from the national government on this issue, we believe, for far too long. And we know that the MAC did advise in July last year that rotational schooling should end. That was the end of the third wave. We know we've had Omicron, but as you saw, Omicron was a lot less dangerous and a lot less virulent than any of the other waves that we've had. And therefore, it made no sense to keep the rotational learning process in place. We're also very concerned around, and again, disproportionately affecting poorer learners, the impact on childhood malnutrition. For many of learners in poorer communities, the only decent meal they get in a day is the school feeding scheme meal that they get at school. If you're not getting that every day and you're only getting it every second day, it has a terrible impact on young learners' health as well and well-being. And you start to see a rise in incidents of malnutrition and the like. So it was just a bad decision all around. And like any decision in government, you've got to always weigh the benefits of something versus the risks. In this instance, the loss of schooling, the impact on health and malnutrition and mental well-being of these students, and the opportunity cost of what's going to be held in their future far outweighs any of the risk that would be presented by Omicron or COVID-19. And therefore, we felt it was very important to put government on notice that this is something that we were going to be very, very serious about. And I think without the court case, that we would have still been involved in this discussion around rotational learning probably into March, April this year. Very glad the government has now seen the light. They've now said schools must go back, and we've got to do it. And obviously, we've got to now focus on how we get those learners back up to speed, and particularly on numeracy and literacy. When one looks at the plummeting rates of that, it is very, very worrying. And this actual decision of rotational learning could well be the longest long COVID that we have, because it's going to stretch into decades to come and be felt in decades to come if we don't make up that time, if we don't get learners back into the system, and then we don't get those numbers up.
Debbie, I want to come to you. There are always complex competing priorities in government, right? You've got to, and I'm going to bring in Keith here at some point about, you've got to bring in the teachers, you've got to consider the trade unions, you've got to consider the learners. But the Western Cape has supported the scrapping of rotational schooling, and why is that?
Yeah, we have, and you're right. It is extremely complex, and part of the problem we had as education was that our national minister actually made it a little easier to go back to school, and then the Cocter minister went and added in a regulation, the 1 metre rule. So that made it a lot more difficult. So we could have had primary schools back a lot earlier. But yes, it is. I mean, the Omicron was a complexity because we didn't know at the time in advance that it was going to be, less severe. And people get very scared, and I get some very anxious parents getting quite hysterical sometimes. So I've got parents on the one hand getting really worried, and teachers on the other hand, and unions on the other. So it is complex, but by the beginning of this year, I think it was quite clear that Omicron wasn't severe. So I made a public call before schools opened that the rotational timetabling should stop because of the exact reasons that John's spoken about. So yes, we certainly have, and we are very happy that it has been done.
Yeah. Keith, just to bring you in here, particularly about these competing interests. I mean, you heading up an organization that has, dealt with matters in education for a long time. I mean, as Debbie says, there are multiple stakeholders here that have had to be considered. And what, in your view, were the key takeaways in this whole debate around rotational schooling?
I think you used the key word a moment ago, but if someone had asked me 2 years ago what's the most important aspect we should be concentrating on to develop education, I would have said teacher training. Now we've had COVID, and COVID, it's a challenge like everything else, and it has led to rethinking, and it's led to a new way of looking at things. So it's actually been, in some ways, quite good. But now if you ask me what's the key aspect of getting basic education back up, I'm going to say teacher training. But this time with a capital T for teacher and a capital T for training.
Yeah.
And because the issue now is that teachers have to do more than just deliver the curriculum.
Yeah.
Now they've got to come in and they've got to catch up. So I'll give you examples. I'll give some examples of schools that I'm currently in. A grade 3 teacher, grade 4 teachers are now taking on children who for 2 years basically haven't done any reading.
Yeah.
So how do you start teaching grade 3 when they've got all this catch up to do?
Yeah.
So the dilemma and the challenge facing the education department, Debbie, is how are you going to catch up while at the same time, what do you do with the current syllabus?
Yeah.
Another example, and another school I was at yesterday, they showed me, so this is not hearsay, but they showed me their statistics from 2020 in grade 4 and 5. And from March when we all went off, their 4s and 5s were only at school for 16 days for the entire year. So now, who wants to be a Minister of Education? Because now, what are you going to do about this problem?
Yeah.
And then a school I was in this morning, before I came here, was a high school, and they gave a baseline test to all their grade 8s in maths.
Yeah.
And less than 5% of them are up to grade 8 standard.
Sure.
Some of them going right down to grade 2 standard.
Yeah.
So these are things that we've got to tackle. And I think that the teachers now need support.
Yeah.
They need to be upskilled.
Yeah.
They need to have their HODs, their heads of subjects, their academic heads. They've got to be trained up to help their teachers. That principals have got to support their management. The curriculum advisors have got to come in, and they've got to be part of it. And it's now a team effort to get this right. And they can't. And we've got to be talking to one another.
I mean, Keith Bax highlights some key, diagnoses some of the key problems, particularly that have been brought about by COVID. But also one of the key indicators in our education system is the matric pass rate, particularly if you look at the dropout rate and such. So, I mean, in your view, how has COVID really changed this whole thing? And I mean, as the DA, what have we been pushing for?
Look, just to add on to what Keith is actually saying is that, I mean, Nexpo did a research and said, by June this year, a grade 3 learner will only know what a grade 2 learner knew in 2019.
Yeah.
And just to even exacerbate the problem, it's not just, 50% of the lost time just generally, but for rural and poor communities, it's between 50 and 80% actually that they've lost the time. And one of the massive things that this has affected is the dropout rate, There's millions of young South African learners that actually drop out of school, hundreds of thousands of them even recently now because of the rotational system. because it discourages learning, number one. But Stats SA also reports to us that of the 10.2 million South Africans that are youth, 3.3 million of them are not in education, employment or training. And there's various reasons why learners drop out. The rotational system is one of them. There are some that are child-headed households. You'll find that parents contribute to learners dropping out, and just the unconducive learning environments in schools. You've got schools that are still of mud, asbestos. Some have got pit toilets, and quality teaching is also a challenge. So there are various aspects and dynamics that actually it's multifaceted that forces learners to drop out. And I think the massive challenge, though, is that there's no one tracking and tracing mechanism to find out where these learners. Some of them could have gone to vocational training, which is a good thing to do. And some of them can be completely part of the 3.3 million that I just mentioned now. And there's no tracking, tracing, there's no retention strategy to get these learners back on board. And I think that's one of the massive and key issues that we need to resolve.
I just want to just ask something here as well, and just bring this into the equation. We live in one of the most unequal societies in the world. Inequality is a huge problem in South Africa. It's internationally recognized that one of the best levelers of inequality is good quality education. If everybody gets the same starting point of a decent quality education, people are allowed to compete on it. We spend a healthy chunk of our GDP on education, but we're not getting the results. We're in the lowest in Africa on STEM skills, science, technology, engineering and maths. We're amongst the lowest in the world in these key skills. Surely it goes beyond just the budget. And there's got to be something that we're doing wrong in South Africa if we are spending money but we're not getting the outcomes.
Yes.
And does it come down again to the teacher training, Debbie?
I would love to answer that.
Debbie, jump in.
It comes up to a lot of things, and one of the key things is accountability in the system, because there have been too much co-governance by unions in education to the point where teachers are not actually held accountable in many cases. Sometimes they haven't got enough opportunities, as Keith says. We have in the Western Cape concentrated a lot on our education and our upskilling and our teacher continuous development. We certainly have. But there are also inefficiencies in how the money is spent. So there's a huge inefficiencies in the provincial equitable share calculation, which I bang on about forever. We've only fairly recently discovered that the special needs schools are not taken into account in the calculation. There's a portion of the equitable share formula where they only take into account public ordinary schools, not public special schools. The result is that 6% of our learners are not being funded. Then they only look at the population part of it, at learners of school-going age, compulsory school-going age, which is 7 to 15. So, yes, there's a lot of money, but there's actually not enough money. But then it's being spent in different provinces where it shouldn't be. And then we've got like 2,000 schools in the Eastern Cape that should have been closed long ago because there's no children in them. And the government just doesn't respond quickly enough to those kind of issues where the money could be better spent on things like teacher development and those kind of issues.
Can I reply to John?
Yes, please.
John, I think the emphasis must be where we're wanting to go. Do we want to just finish curricula? Or, as I'm suggesting, we must concentrate on getting up to scratch first, otherwise you're building a house on dodgy foundations. And I would like to suggest that curriculum advisors and everyone comes up with the premise of you haven't taught until you've learned. And if everyone adopts that, you can't move on until they've learned. So your teaching must be geared towards learning.
But we know there's been a resistance to teacher standards and teacher. One of the big interventions, I remember Bill Clinton writes about it in his book. How he turned Arkansas from being one of the lowest educational output states in the United States into one of the best when he was governor, was taking the pain and bringing in teacher quality training and standards. And as you said, you can't teach what you cannot learn. And I think that there's going to have to be a grasping of the nettle at some stage to make sure. I've been to some schools where the teacher teaching the mathematics would struggle to pass the paper at the end of the year themselves.
That's exactly right.
So how do we encourage the training, but then also have the minimum standards so that you're able to make sure that young people are getting the quality education that they deserve.
And Bess, I want to bring you in here. You've done a lot of oversight around the country, been seeing some of the problems that Debbie's talking about, that Keith is talking about, some of the questions that John has. In your view, from what you've seen, what are some of the issues?
Look, I was about to jump into what John was raising about, we're putting a lot of money, but we're not getting anything out of it. So there's three things, first and foremost, that we've analyzed. One is that the type of curricula that we put in place must be outcome-based, based on being responsive to skills needed by the economy. As much as basic education is, numeracy, literacy, language, and the basics, but there must be a pathway for you to be able to achieve that. And that must be funded, as Debbie says. But the way in which you fund it, you don't put players that are trying to increase the prices of funding, equipment and support for math, science, and other, STEM subjects that are there. But secondly, in terms of the infrastructure, you find that there are schools, for example, in Mpumalanga, I visited a school, Vezimfundo. It's built for 32 million on a wetland, and it was supposed to be built for about 16 million rand. So you're exacerbating the price of creating the infrastructure and the space so that there's conducive learning to get the outcomes. And the last and most important thing is quality teaching. There needs to be a school monitoring evaluation committee or commissions in the different provinces to monitor quality teaching. I mean, they've got in the Western Cape where they actually monitor the quality of teaching so that you actually have outcomes. So some of the challenges that we've seen across the country visiting the schools, you'll find that there's some mud and asbestos schools. You find that there are schools that still use pit toilets that I said it's unconducive for learning. But majority of the teachers are complaining that look, the rotational system is actually not assisting us. One, we can't cover the curriculum. Our learners can't read and read for meaning, they can't write. And it's important for us to be able to change that first and foremost, and then come up with the strategy of how to, catch up with the curriculum so that we are actually producing outcomes. Because we don't want to end up with a generation that is going to form part of these stats of youth unemployment, youth not in education or training, and end up living a lifetime of poverty. So these are some of the strategies that we need to put in place.
Keith's point about building the foundation, a solid foundation, going back to the basics, building that foundation and then building up from there.
Exactly. I want to bring in Debbie here because Gwarube raises an important point about catching up. I mean, we've all been dealt a blow globally. It's not just a uniquely South African issue. And so, now we've got this mammoth task of making sure that the past 18 months we catch up. What are some of the conversations that we're having to make sure that kids do?
There are a lot of conversations. Last week, there was a basic education sector lekgotla in Johannesburg, and it was extremely good, I thought. And there were a lot of really good inputs from international guests as well as local. And there's a feeling that we have to trim down to some extent to get to the basic key concepts. I mean, the general consensus is that our CAPS curriculum is actually very good, internationally renowned. It's just, it's very full, and we need to just focus on the key issues that we have to get right, and that is reading, writing, calculating, essentially in the foundation phase. So that is one of the things we've been concentrating on in the Western Cape for quite some time, but it obviously has been affected by COVID. So we do have to do that. So there are a lot of conversations happening at national level also as to how we're going to deal with this backlog. It has got huge implications. There's studies done before COVID even existed. There were studies about just 4 months of school closures, what effect that had on a learner's earning capacity for the rest of their life, plus obviously the economy of the country, and it ran into trillions of dollars. Sure. So it is important, but as has also been mentioned, our teachers have also taken strain in COVID. It's not only the learners, they've taken a lot of strain. It's been extremely, there's been a lot of anxiety. It's been very difficult for them to have to teach half a class. They then have to get the children, they've taught something 2 days ago, and then they've forgotten it. They have to teach it over again. So it is really difficult, and we're going to have intensive, I think, particularly the foundation phase. Okay. Fortunately, there is, at the higher grades, particularly in maths, as Keith mentioned, the baseline tests in grade 8, we've found as a really, really good program, that's an online program that we've tried, and it's been tried in Mpumalanga actually also, and we now are expanding it. And if we can get more of that, because teachers can't do everything themselves personally, and it adapts to the learner's individual learning gaps and addresses those. So we can use that also to some extent, I think, but the little ones need the teachers there and intensive catch up, to get back on track.
And John, I mean, the BACS talks about the possibility of an entire lost generation. I mean, our schooling system has been ailing all these years, and then you have a situation where an entire generation of kids is likely. So this is urgent. I mean, it's something that should feature in the survey.
And really, the thing that always brings it home to me is that this is the way we're going to deal with inequality. This is the way you're going to create a more equal society when everyone is given the same starting point and given access to opportunity. That way you have an equality of opportunity, not an equality of outcome. And you then have people with a foundation to be able to go on and be entrepreneurs, technologists, engineers, all these skills that South Africa needs to get moving are there. This is the raw material, but we're not turning it, we're not beneficiating it into productive members of society, which is why we sit with school leavers, people who even finish school without work. In an economy where you've got a 42% unemployment rate, it is devastating.
Yeah.
But education is one of the key rungs on the ladder of opportunity to get people out of poverty and into opportunity. And we're going to have to, as a country, as Keith has said, work together. Educators, learners, unions, policymakers, to really do something drastic, because I really do worry that the rest of the world is going to catch up, make up the time, and once again South Africa is going to be left behind, and the world will be waving goodbye as they move on to the next level, and we're still stuck in the past. We've got to do something, and got to do it urgently, which is why we passionately went forward with this rotational learning case. Court cases aren't cheap, and I would rather have spent the money on political pamphlets or political activity, but I understand how deeply unequal the rotational learning policy affected poorer communities, people who don't have a voice at the table, people who don't have someone rooting for them in national government. And I thought it was important that as the DA, we give a voice to those poor people and to those learners and fight for their future.
Yeah. And I mean, Keith, you talk about teacher training as one of the ways in which we can catch up, because I do want to, I want to hear all of your views about this. You talk about teacher training as a way to catch up what has been lost. What other things can we do, and working together? What other things can we do to make sure that we kind of leapfrog kids to at least get to a decent place of making up the last 18 months?
Look, even if you just concentrate on that on a basic level, we've done a good job, because if you can get your heads of department, if you can get this within the schools for training and learning, training of teachers to take place, and then your management to get trained, if you do that, that is a huge step forward. And you asked me earlier on about teacher dropout, and then we got pupil dropout, and we got sidetracked a little bit there. But again, I'm going to say it is really, everything is down to the teacher, and it's the teacher's job to create confidence in children. And if children are confident, they're less likely to drop out. I mean, everyone here are masters of their craft, and you've got confidence in what you do. And we've got to get our children to that level as well. And we've got to make sure that at foundation phase they can read. And there's a school of thought that if you can read by the end of grade 3 with comprehension and with understanding, you will revolutionize this country if you can just concentrate on that. And how do you get people to read? It is just confidence. But I am hearing more and more stories about people who didn't even bother to write matric because they said we're not going to pass, so why try? And so all the way through school, the teacher's job is to say, I'm on your team, I'm here to support you, we're going to do this together. And I tell you what, you will get retention then. And if you've got reading by the end of grade 3, and you've got retention from 1 to 7 and then 8 to 12, you'll change education in this country.
And you would think that would be a catalytic change for South Africa.
It would be a huge change.
You said it would be a revolutionary change, I think it was.
How do we retain kids in school? Why do we have a problem of high dropout rates?
Look, the first and foremost, we need to look at innovative ways. One of them is obviously giving confidence and quality teaching in schools, like, as Keith has mentioned. But we need to develop a home and online school policy that will alleviate the pressure of the pressure in classroom and learners being able to do it. And there's been innovations that have been done by UCT, and this has been piloted, and that it actually does work. And we need to now get caps onto that system and make sure that we're actually educating learners that have got that option so they don't crowd them. And the second thing is that we need to track and trace learners from the classroom in the school. The province keeps a database, and then we check, because it's dynamic. Some are child-headed households, like I said. Some are discouraged of learning. I mean, there's 29,000 learners that didn't write matric, because of the confidence issue. So where are they, in the system? Where can we find them? Okay, cool, they're in vocational learning, then that's fine. Where's the remainder of them? And how do we retain them to ensure that we encourage them in learning? Some learners struggle with, financial support. What are the pathways and mechanisms that we can give to make sure that we actually keep them in school.
Yeah.
So some of these are the dynamics that we can, that we have to deal with to make sure that we try and keep learners in school.
But I also think it's got to be a whole of government approach.
Yeah.
And I think this is what Debbie talks about a lot, is that a lot of the burden is being put onto the school or to the Department of Education.
Yes.
So some of the innovative things we should be looking at. We've got a whole Department of Social Development.
Yes.
People accessing child support grants should have to produce proof that their children are enrolled at school.
Yes, absolutely. Correct.
That it can't just be here's money for you to look after your child. It is in the best interest of the child. If you go back to the Constitution, it talks about decisions always being made in the best interest of the child.
Yeah.
It is the best interest for any child in South Africa to go to school. And therefore, I think we've got to be a lot more innovative in a whole of government approach. So the burden doesn't just fall on Department of Basic Education.
Sure.
It is a responsibility that's shared throughout government. So
Completely agree.
to make sure that not only are you tracking and tracing, but there is incentivization to make sure that children are enrolled in school and that they remain in school.
Yeah. Debbie, like the health system, the education system becomes also a bit of a catchment for all kinds of societal issues. And what are some of the issues that you are picking up that also, contribute to this kind of dropout and this kind of issues that we're seeing?
First of all, I just want to say, John's quite correct. We can't have the education department responsible for everyone who drops out and what they do after that. So we do need a system, I agree. It's just where that system sits, I think. And there needs to be a lot more synergy between us and higher education also. So you see those who do go to TVET. But one of the reasons we found, and we have identified the issue of foundation phase quite some time ago, we've had a lot of emphasis on foundation phase teaching and learning to do exactly that. We're not where we would like to be, but we certainly have seen, we're the only province that has systemic testing in grade 3, 6 and 9. Once again, the unions don't agree with it. But we find it very useful, and we find it very useful because it actually diagnoses problems in every classroom, literally every classroom. So it can be used by the principals at the school to then assist with programs to address those issues that are problematic. So that's one issue. Other things, of course, that it is true about issues of confidence and so on, and of teachers. And one of the things we've brought in the last few years in the Western Cape is called a Transform to Perform program, part of which is the change mindset and a growth mindset program. So we have change mindset for teachers because very often the teachers, particularly in poor communities, have this kind of attitude that, you're from a poor community, you're stupid, you can't go anywhere in life, and that's it. So, and also they have difficulty dealing with the circumstances they have to teach in. Many of them have to duck bullets while their gangs are fighting and so on. So we're helping the teachers with that, and we're also helping the learners with the growth mindset project, to try and ensure that they get that belief in themselves instilled, that they can do it. And we've started with some of our metrics, and it is starting to show some promise. It's still very early, but it is starting to show some promise. Of course, there are also issues of safety and gangsterism. It's a big problem for us. Learner pregnancies, we have addressed that quite well. We do provide a lot of support for learners who get pregnant so that they don't drop out of school. Money is an issue sometimes, but we do provide a hang of a lot of free services for education. People who can't pay do not have to pay school fees. Learner transport can be a problem in cities because our policy only extends to rural communities. But anyone who lives 5 kilometres or more from a school is entitled to learner transport, and they get it. So, very often it does boil down to parents just not taking responsibility. And I've just recently had a case where I've had, closed a school. It had 19 children in it with one teacher. That's not beneficial for anybody. But people are saying, you're creating orphans. I said, no, you're not. Just please help us get your children to the school that they can go to, and we will provide transport for it. So it is also a parental responsibility to make sure that and in the latest bailable amendments, which have just been tabled in Parliament, the Minister is actually wanting to increase the sanction for anyone who does not send their compulsory school-going age child to school.
Sure.
So,
Well, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If it's enforced, of course.
Yes, of course. I want to start with you, Keith. Final parting shots on what should be done to fix broadly. I know that there are a number of things. What should be our priorities? Very quickly around our education system, and at least plugging in the holes that are kind of bleeding at the moment.
I'll just have to bang on about teachers. If you've got teachers, you can pour money into school buildings, and you can do it, but it's actually teachers at the end of the game that are going to change the system. It's been proven around the world. You were mentioning off air just now that Scandinavia have teachers with master's degrees. With teachers, things will change. But I think that where we've got to move forward now, we've had 2 years of fear. We've been frightened of COVID. We've been frightened of what's going to happen, where's it going to go. Long COVID, you mentioned early on. And now we must move into the era of fear of what's going to happen to our children.
Yeah.
And that's the new fear. And are they going to get left behind, and are they going to have a future?
Absolutely.
And when I told one of my principals I was going to come onto this panel, she said to me, do it for South Africa. Go and say how important the teachers are in changing the system.
Absolutely. Pax, what are your marching orders for the next year in the very important portfolio of basic education?
Look, like I said, one, we need to have a curriculum that's responsive to the economy and industry, entrepreneurship and innovation. Number two, we have to have innovative ways, like we've mentioned, how to retain and keep learners in school. Thirdly, we must deal with the long-term systematic issues in basic education to make sure that when we fund infrastructure, we actually do it out of quality outcomes and not people using that opportunity to actually make money out of it. And I think most importantly, like Keith has said, we need to have a school evaluations monitoring authority that can monitor quality teaching and also encourage that, that type of mindset that Debbie spoke about for teachers and learners, so that we don't have a generation, like I said earlier, that is going to be dependent on the state and is going to live a lifetime of poverty. And with these things, we can set up a pathway and an opportunity ladder for the future for our learners. And I think that's the most important thing, and we'll continue doing that work and oversight and trying to make sure that government actually does what it needs to do.
Can I just say that we've heard a couple of times now about teacher evaluation. I think it's absolutely critical. I think it's absolutely critical that it's taken seriously, and I think it's absolutely critical that teachers see it as a way of improving and not as a way of being or something about
police.
And I think it's essential for the teacher evaluation.
Debbie, your marching orders, I mean, it's a big year. Already started off very difficult, but you've already gotten a win in your bag. We've got,
matric results.
No, matric results.
And you don't purge learners, so that's also
great matric results, scrapped rotational schooling. Now, where to from now?
I agree with Keith completely about teacher, but I'll go a step further and actually promote his organisations like his, and that's actually the principals. I mean, the training of principals and instructional leadership is crucial, and then obviously the teachers too, to enable them to continuously develop themselves. And I've also seen it time and time again, when you've got a principal who's not running the school well, the whole school suffers, and vice versa. So I would go instructional leadership for principals, definitely teach development, and get those foundation phase gaps addressed as soon as possible.
John, an incapable state can create a massive, massive problem for generations to come. What are your marching orders for the Democratic Alliance in ensuring that we're also solutions-orientated like we were in taking government to court?
Well, I think that we've got to be clear about what our enemy is in South Africa, and our biggest enemy is poverty. It underlies our infant mortality rate, it underlies our HIV/AIDS rate, it underlies our malnutrition, etc. We've got to tackle poverty, and one of the best ways to tackle poverty is producing citizens who can compete in an economy, able to find work, are able to have startups, to be entrepreneurs, and are able to fill the technical skills gap that South Africa desperately needs. We're only going to get to that front line against poverty. We've got a good quality education system that gives children the confidence to be able to become active citizens, to become productive citizens, and to be able to march confidently into the future of South Africa. I don't want our big entrepreneurs to leave South Africa. I want them to stay in South Africa and help us tackle poverty. And that has got to be our singular focus. And I've told the DA, the ANC is part of the problem. There's so many parts of the problem. The big enemy is poverty, and we've got to find a way to deal with it. And education, to me, is one of the silver bullets, one of the game changers that lies at us beating poverty. If we can get our education system working well, producing the results, giving us productive citizens who've got a best shot of competing, not only in South Africa, but competing internationally. I think that it'll be a game changer for South Africa.
And it changes the system and doesn't just deal with issues at a surface level, right? Because that can be a big problem with our political debate and our issues in Parliament.
But you see, that's the problem. This is not like, and this is the problem, I'm afraid, with national government, is that we focus on the ribbon cutting and the look at me, we're delivering project. we don't focus enough on the opportunity side of the economy and where we can grow opportunity in South Africa. And education is undoubtedly one of the things. A lot of the things we've spoken about today are not sexy. They're not going to make headlines. But they are the hard yards that any country has to get right if it's going to progress. And yes, it's not glamorous doing teacher training and doing teacher evaluation. It's not glamorous, doing some of the things we've spoken about.
Foundation phase.
You're not going to have a picture on the front page of the newspaper because you've run the best foundation phase. But it is essential, because if you don't have those foundations, as Keith has said, you're building your community halls, your infrastructure on an incredibly shaky foundation that's eventually going to collapse. Let's get these foundations right, build up from there.
Is this a little teaser of what we're to expect next week at the True State of the Nation address?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's an obvious. We've got to fight poverty in this country. There are 30 million people who live below the poverty line in South Africa. Their cause has to be our concern. And we need to be focusing on the opportunity side of the economy, looking at how we can help those people out of poverty into opportunity and allow them to build a life of value and to leave a legacy for their children and build a better future for those that come after them.